Whispers beneath the canopy, the haunted forest. The dense fog wrapped around the ancient trees like a living thing, clinging to the twisted limbs that reached toward the sky in unnatural angles. In the heart of the Liswald, known only to locals as the Forgotten Canopy, the forest stretched for miles without end. Few dared to enter, and those who did often returned with their minds unraveling, whispering about the Elderwood, a being that lived deep within the trees. Shalmali had heard of the canopy's terrifying reputation, but to him it was just superstition. A scholar of the occult and the unknown, Shalmali was obsessed with ancient texts, particularly those that detailed old rites and rituals long forgotten by man. One night, while thumbing through an ancient manuscript, he came across a passage that described a forest in a distant land, a place where the trees were not simply plants, but conscious, alive, and far older than humanity itself. It was a forest where the earth itself whispered in forgotten tongues, where travelers disappeared without a trace, where Elderwood, a being born from the union of the trees and the earth itself, fed upon the souls of those who wandered too close. The manuscript was clear. The forest, once a cradle of ancient worship, held within it a powerful and malevolent presence, a being that was neither god nor demon, but something far older, a consciousness entwined with the very soil and roots of the earth. Driven by an insatiable thirst for knowledge, and a belief that he could outwit whatever malevolent force dwelled within the trees, Shalmali made his way to Liswald. Upon arriving in the small village on the outskirts of the forest, Shalmali encountered an old man sitting near a flickering fire. The man, with skin as weathered as bark, stared at him with a knowing look. "You seek the forest's heart, don't you?" the man croaked. Shalmali nodded, intrigued by the stranger's insight. "I wish to understand its power, to uncover the truth about what lies beneath." The old man's eyes darkened. "You can never understand it, young scholar. There is no truth that can be grasped. There are only the whispers of those who went before you. You'll hear them in the trees, see them in the shadows, and you'll lose yourself in them. They are not like us." Shalmali, unfazed, pressed on. The old man's warning seemed merely the ramblings of a superstitious local. The entrance to the Forgotten Canopy was marked by a great arch of gnarled trees, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost human. Shalmali passed beneath it, and the air shifted, cooler, thicker, as if the trees themselves were closing in around him. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the silence grew heavy, pressing in on him. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the earth wet with moisture from a perpetual fog. He could hear the rustling of leaves, but not from the wind. No, it was something else, something that seemed to carry voices, half-formed and unintelligible. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time seemed to lose meaning in the depths of the forest. Shalmali could no longer discern whether he was walking in circles, or if the trees themselves were shifting, subtly guiding him deeper into the heart of the forest. It was then that he heard it, a whisper. At first it was faint, like a breeze moving through the leaves, but then it grew louder, a string of words unrecognizable, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling his name. Shalmali stopped, heart hammering in his chest. He spun around, but there was no one behind him. Only the trees stretching up into the mist like dark, ancient pillars. "Who's there?" Shalmali called, his voice trembling. The whispering stopped. A sudden cold swept through the air, making Shalmali's breath catch in his throat. He turned to continue on, but then a soft crackling sound like dry leaves crunching beneath someone's feet echoed behind him. He whirled around again, his eyes scanning the fog, but there was no one. The forest, still and silent, seemed to mock his panic. Then the ground beneath him trembled, and a low groan sounded from the earth itself, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the roots of the trees. The air vibrated, and Shalmali's mind began to throb in time with the pulse of the forest. The whisper returned, but now it was clearer, the voice sharper, and it was no longer just calling his name. The voice now spoke in a tongue older than anything Shalmali had ever heard. He couldn't understand it, but he could feel its meaning within him. An invitation, an offering, a demand. The trees creaked, their branches shifting, twisting as if alive, and then the forest itself seemed to wake, stretching and groaning in the fog. The shapes of the trees blurred before his eyes, their bark shifting to reveal eyes, ancient and endless, staring down at him. Elderwood was no longer a myth, it was real, and it was awake. Shalmali's mind cracked under the pressure. He dropped to his knees, his hands clutching his head as the whispers tore through his thoughts. Memories, his own and not his own, began to flood his mind. Forgotten names, images of twisting roots, glimpses of unspeakable horrors that defied description. In that moment, Shalmali understood. The forest was a living being, a consciousness older than the world itself, and it would never let him leave. The trees closed in around him, their roots curling around his legs, pulling him into the earth, where he would become one with the elderwood, forever lost in its endless whispers. Our second story is about the pet cemetery. Here is how it goes. The small town of Oak Ridge had always felt like it was stuck in time. Its cobbled streets, the old brick storefronts, and the constant, ever-present fog that rolled in from the swampland. But for all its quaintness, there was a darker side to Oak Ridge, one that even the most curious visitor could never fully grasp. Hallowed Ground Pet Cemetery sat on the outskirts of town, shrouded in shadows, a place no one dared enter after sundown. Alyssa Graves hadn't been back to Oak Ridge in years, not since she was a child. She had left the town behind, following her dreams to become a veterinary student, far away from the strange, almost superstitious rumors that had surrounded her childhood. But when her parents died in a car accident, Alyssa was forced to return to their old, crumbling home, a house now empty, filled with memories of happier times. It was in that empty house that Alyssa began to feel the weight of grief. She missed her parents, of course, but there was another presence she longed for, the one that had kept her company throughout her childhood. Zephyr, her loyal dog, the one who had always been there to comfort her. He had died years ago and had been buried in the Hallowed Ground Pet Cemetery. Alyssa remembered the peaceful little resting place, with its overgrown paths and the forgotten graves of all the pets whose owners had loved them too much to part with. One cold, misty afternoon, Alyssa decided to visit Zephyr's grave. She needed to feel close to him again, to remember that time when things weren't so broken. The cemetery was quiet, save for the sound of her footsteps on the uneven ground. Tall gravestones stood like silent sentinels, their inscriptions faded, names worn away by the ravages of time. Some graves were little more than crude markers, while others were elaborate, monuments to long-lost pets, each one a reminder of someone's broken heart. As she walked through the rows of graves, Alyssa felt a strange unease settle over her. The air was heavy, thick with something that was more than just the humidity of the swamp nearby. There was something watching her, a feeling, not a presence, but a sensation that seemed to creep into the edges of her mind, making her skin prickle. When she reached Zephyr's grave, she knelt down and brushed away the leaves that had gathered over the small stone marker. For a moment she let the silence surround her, her thoughts drifting back to those carefree days of childhood. But then something caught her eye. The ground was disturbed. The soil had been freshly dug, the earth loose and unsettled. Something had been recently unearthed. Alyssa's heart began to pound as she gently pressed her fingers into the soil. As she pulled away a handful of dirt, she was horrified to see that there was no coffin, no remains, only an empty hole. Before she could gather her thoughts, an old voice called from behind her. "You shouldn't be here." Startled, Alyssa whipped around to see a frail old man standing at the edge of the cemetery. His clothes were ragged, his eyes sunken, and his face covered in a layer of grime. He looked like someone who hadn't seen the sun in years. I just came to visit an old friend," Alyssa stammered, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The old man shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "This is hallowed ground, miss. There's no peace here, no resting. Not anymore." "What do you mean?" Alyssa asked, still kneeling by Zephyr's grave. The old man's eyes seemed to flicker with something, recognition, or perhaps fear, as he approached her. "They don't rest here. None of them do. Not anymore. not since the altar was built beneath this land. Alyssa's brow furrowed. What altar? What are you talking about? The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The cemetery was built on top of an old site, an altar where rituals were performed long ago. There were people, cultists perhaps, who believed that the spirits of animals could open a doorway to another world. They believed that by sacrificing the souls of their pets, they could bridge the gap between the living and something far darker. And the animals, they became the vessels. Alyssa stood, shaking her head in disbelief. You're saying this cemetery is some sort of ritual site? The old man nodded grimly. Yes, and every time an animal was buried, it wasn't just a resting place. It was a link, a way for the dark forces to return. But something went wrong. The energy they summoned, it never left. Alyssa felt a chill run down her spine. But Zephyr? The old man pointed toward the grave. He was a vessel too, like the rest of them, and now they're all waking up. Suddenly the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Alyssa's heart raced as the soil shifted. From the corner of her eye, she saw shapes moving among the gravestones. Figures. Small, twisted figures, hunched over like animals. The ground erupted as skeletal dogs and cats, their eyes gleaming with unnatural light, began to claw their way from the graves. Zephyr's grave shifted violently, and from the earth emerged his body, but not as it once was. His form was decayed, his eyes hollow, his fur matted and wet with something foul. He stood before her, his head cocked to one side as if recognizing her, but not truly seeing her. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat. And then Alyssa understood. The animals were never truly dead. The cemetery, the ritual, the altar, they had brought them back, but at a terrible cost. The spirits of the animals were now bound to something older, something far more powerful, and they could never be freed. Zephyr's empty eyes locked with hers, and the whispers began. Join us, they said. Join us in the dark. Alyssa screamed as the ground shifted beneath her feet, and the world around her darkened. She felt a pull, a presence, dragging her toward the grave, toward the void. The cemetery was no longer a resting place. It was a gate, and Alyssa was about to become part of the endless procession of souls bound to it.